everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you might be dialing in from around the world. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, Find the Mules, Stop the Fraud, presented by Dados Insights. I'm Caitlin Labby, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. We'll be starting the webinar shortly, but first, let me just cover a few quick housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be recorded, and a link to view the recording on demand will be available after the session. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to submit your questions using the questions feature located in the GoToWebinar toolbar to the right of your screen. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Trace Fouché is a strategic advisor in Dados Insights fraud and AML practice, covering fraud and data security issues. Trace has been leading business transformation initiatives for over 20 years. He started his professional career in Singapore, where he focused on delivering process automation solutions for banking and securities clients by way of workflow and document management-based transformations. After moving back to the United States, he broadened the scope of his focus to include consulting with clients on customer relationship management practices and client loyalty for Ernst & Young. Trace also speaks frequently in industry conferences on topics related to payments and fraud prevention. So without further ado, I'll turn the mic over to Trace for further introductions and to dive into today's content. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Take it away, Trace.
Thanks, Caitlin, and hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm going to dive right into our material today, just because we've got a lot of real estate to cover, and I'd like for us to try to get it through as much of that as possible. So real quickly, we're going to cover background and definitions because we need to. I think it's important in being able to kind of all be on the same page and knowing where we are and how we got here with regard to mule activity. Want to then cover trends and market dynamics that surround monitoring and proactively preventing mule activity. And then finally, want to land on what are some of the implications of those market dynamics, because I think there's some pretty interesting developments that are on the horizon with regard to mule activity. So with regard to getting background, I'm going to go through this as quickly as I can. We did some recent research around fraud organizational structures and organizational structures in fraud relative to other organizational structures under the financial crime umbrella. And in that research, we discovered that there are really two definitions for financial crime. Most will recognize the formal definition, but to many fraud practitioners, the colloquial definition is used commonly enough that I felt it needed to be clarified. That when I use the term, at least in the context of this presentation, I'm referring to the formal definition of financial crime. I also bring it up because it helps to make a point about the degree to which compartmentalization of duties has created a kind of distortion in how practitioners talk about what they do relative to broader strategic concepts. The broader strategic concept in this case is the management of financial crime under that formal definition. And I hope that by the end of this presentation, you'll have an appreciation for how our collective understanding of this strategic objective is shifting and maturing into something of a little bit more of a deliberate and formally defined corporate strategy that's easier to articulate and hopefully with a little bit of time and experience, a little easier to manage. Also, a little bit of background here, just to kind of set the stage, at least in terms of how do we get here. This is an attempt to distill financial crime down into a concise value chain. And I do this partly to encapsulate the challenges that financial institutions are expected to control for if they wish to build healthy trust relationships with their customers. They don't have mule control because there are only two obligations that FIs have to satisfy. They have mule activity only after they confirm that it's happened. KYC requirements are specific about what's required in order to adequately test that the applicant's identity does not match with a known criminal, but beyond that, they're not terribly specific about monitoring for mules. Given that most mules are either legitimate customers who are either knowingly complicit or that have themselves been duped or they're synthetic identities, KYC controls are not terribly effective at screening out mules. Regarding detection, the requirement is to report on the activity that if the FI knows, suspects, or has reason to suspect that the transaction involves funds derived from illegal activities. Such insights are exceptionally uncommon at an FI that is sending funds, much less at one that's receiving the funds. So it's little surprise that mule activity is not frequently detected unless or until the nature of how the funds were derived from illegal activities is revealed, which is usually by law enforcement, by the courts, or by the sending bank, who themselves are often only made aware by the victim. This illustrates an important distinction in controlling for mule activity, which is the difference between proactive detection and reactive reporting. Proactive detection is encouraged but not enforced, whereas reactive reporting is required and enforced. Proactive detection is not enforced because FIs have a pretty solid defense for not having the capabilities to know whether the source of funds in an inbound payment is the result of illegal activities. It's assumed that the receiving FI would know less about the nature of the money being sent than the sending FI would know. Historically, this assumption has been valid, but the ecosystem has evolved, and so too has the market for detection and prevention controls. So let's turn our attention to the trends in the market. If we can't describe what we're doing, then we don't know what we're doing. That's another Six Sigma nerd quote for you, courtesy of Dr. Deming. The trends in enforcement actions against FIs has pretty clearly shown an emphasis on violations of BSA Patriot Act obligations. Similarly, there has been a significant increase in the degree of scrutiny by boards of directors and corporate priorities to shore up cybersecurity defenses in the wake of so many highly publicized data breach incidents over the past 10 to 15 years. This shift in priorities and budgets comes courtesy of the perception that failure to properly address these risks will ultimately erode the trust relationships that it has with its customers and prospects. But what about the degree to which fraud losses and negative client experiences stemming from fraud? Do they also contribute to an erosion of trust? As we discussed earlier, of course they do. However, there are two considerations here. First, FIs are not required to disclose fraud losses, so those losses wouldn't negatively impact reputational risk unless it reaches or surpasses a critical mass of incident rates, in which case the cat will be out of the bag, and by then the bigger problem will be profitability. Second, while regulators have always been interested in ensuring that FIs have adequate fraud controls, it's also true that until recently, FIs have been able to demonstrate that the rates of losses and negative impact to client experience have been relatively well controlled, such that they've stayed within risk tolerances. There are indications, however, that the status quo may be changing. As stimulus fraud ramped up in 2020 and 2021, many, including myself, predicted that this would draw a lot of heat on financial institutions. The thinking went that someone, perhaps the taxpayer most of all, would want to know why so much money was lost to fraud and why more wasn't done to prevent the loss. Even if FIs knew of the full extent of the amount of fraudulent funds coursing through the system, and most did not know at the time, then as we've discussed, there are not a lot of influential incentives for proactive detection and prevention. As the contours of the stimulus fraud became known, it clearly had an impact. The graph on the right reflects a sea change of interest in proactive mule tracking, detection, and prevention, which had historically been relatively low on the scale of priorities. In fact, prior to 2021, very few FIs acknowledged any interest in proactive tracking, detection, or prevention of mule activities. So this is another graph that demonstrates the degree to which priorities have shifted in favor of proactive mule detection and prevention. Fraud executives reported in 2022 that mule activity was among the top 3 areas of most concern in terms of their ability to adequately detect and control. This is for good reason. In separate consumer research that we conducted, 57% of consumers polled indicated that they did not understand that moving money for someone else could implicate them as complicit in a crime. Worse yet, 10% of consumers between 18 and 24 would willingly sign up to move money if they were promised some portion of the funds transferred. Another important trend at work that's reshaping financial crime strategies is the pace and scale of growth in consumer fraud. Scams and check fraud have been leading that growth in North America, of course, which is particularly problematic. It's problematic because these are the 2 types of fraud that consumers are especially vulnerable to and that FIs are not terribly well prepared to prevent. Both are growing substantially, and if the criminologists Rosenfeld and Farango are correct, then so long as consumer sentiment about economic conditions remains dismal, fraud attacks are likely to remain elevated. Of the 2 types of fraud, scams are the most problematic in terms of the threat to the trust relationship. FIs have a financial incentive to step up efforts to combat check fraud, and while many will, it's also true that the analog nature of the threat won't be easily or quickly conquered. FIs are also incentivized to step up efforts to control for scam attacks, and many have been mobilizing to that effect, but the market's response is only now beginning to take shape and gain some real substantial momentum. In the meantime, I think the pressure seems likely that it will continue to build. And it's certainly been building. That is evidenced by the rash of articles in the mainstream media, as well as inquiries from legislators. These are just a handful of some of the articles that have emerged over the last year and a half, as well as the report that was issued by Senator Warren and others on the rising rates of scam activity, in this case on P2P networks. So the trends in North America are not isolated. In fact, the trends in the direction of shifts in liability for scam reimbursements have been building in many markets, perhaps most notably in the United Kingdom, who's been struggling through the scam apocalypse longer than anyone. In the UK, the Payment Systems Regulator, the PSR, has been going through some very well publicized and has gained a lot of attention for proposing to place a net new burden on receiving banks that's forcing UK fraud executives to rethink their financial crime strategies. Specifically, their proposal would place a 50-50 split between the sending bank and the receiving bank. This ultimately has the result of placing a net new financial burden on receiving banks that just didn't exist or hasn't existed until this new regime, which is expected to go into implementation as soon as the first quarter of 2024. In Brazil, they have a reimbursement requirement already in place, but they take it to 11 by having the central bank publicly publishing each financial institution's fraud performance metrics. In speaking with Brazilian bankers and fraud executives for research into faster payments and the impact on fraud, there recently, a lot of the Brazilian bankers pointed out that that has done a lot to motivate financial institutions to avoid having any kind of being associated with having poor fraud controls, which I think was a pretty interesting development there. In the US, of course, there's still mostly rumor, but some recurring themes are beginning to emerge. One of those themes that I've noticed is the use of a phrase by some legislators. The phrase is fraudulently induced. To me, it seems to be a reflection of an intent to want to change the definition of unauthorized in Regulation E, such that it would include what many FIs now would call authorized. We'll have to see where exactly that goes. Again, I'm not a legal scholar there, but I can imagine that would be vulnerable to challenge and to litigation, and I'm not exactly certain how strong a defense there would be to those legal challenges. These trends are shaping the market for scam detection solutions more broadly. Perhaps the most notable means by which this is shaping them, though, is on the receiving side. And this, again, is where we kind of reconnect with the theme of Mules. In monitoring the trends in how the market is shaping up to meet the scam, the challenge of controlling for scams, what has been interesting to me has been that the segment of the market that's been growing perhaps and getting the most attention, at least in the early stages of the market's development, has been on the receiving side. I believe this is largely because of all of the segments of the market that are emerging. This one is probably the one that is perhaps the most approachable. And if I could explain, it may be second only to the proactive prevention, which I will also point out is by far and away the one that's getting the most attention right now. So I don't want to come across as saying that proactive prevention isn't getting a lot of attention, isn't getting a lot of prioritization. It absolutely is, and it is perhaps the most approachable. It is the one thing that I think every FI is prepared to take action on. I think the second place goes to receive side detection. So these are monitoring of inbound payments and placing more controls around inbound payments. I think this does raise a lot of questions, however, about what form these inbound payment monitoring controls are taking. And this again kind of brings us full circle to why we're talking about mule activity. Is one of the most obvious means for monitoring inbound payments is in having a really good idea or a much more sophisticated view on who the beneficiaries in your institution are, and being able to predict whether those beneficiaries are likely to fit one of several of those mule persona profiles that we talked about earlier. So to the degree that this is a favored approach in terms of the marketplace, it's not terribly surprising. That is a much more doable thing, I think, for many FIs to consider, especially when you consider that the models for detecting outbound payments are very challenging, very resource intensive, and can be very expensive, as well as the send side interventions can often introduce a lot of friction. And of course, the feedback in some of these approaches in markets such as the UK have not been universally positive. And then of course, I think the likelihood of network-based detection capabilities, as well as recovery automation, are something that are a little bit further down the road yet, even still. But we'll go back to those in the implication sections. I did want to point out real quickly before we close out in the market dynamics segment here that there's a lot of evidence that the global demand for mule detection is actually on the increase. So this comes from some research that we did recently in what was it, the US, UK, India, and Brazil. This was a look at the controls that fraud executives were emphasizing in terms of counteracting the rise in threats related to fraud on the faster payments channel. And as you can see here, that Mule activity is taking a pretty high priority in terms of their interest. One last point here with regard to overall trajectory in terms of the shape of financial crime strategies. The persistence of the convergence trend, as well as the emphasis among regulators for more robust red flag programs, I think these are fairly well established. These have certainly been around for many years. You know, myself, I can remember going back 10 years or more to conversations that came up every 2 years about why fraud and AML and cybersecurity were not the same organizational unit, and then having that discussion only to have it see it reemerge 2 years later and having to have the same conversations all over again. That's not to say that there shouldn't be more in the way of collaboration and coordination among these relatively siloed business units in an effort to build more coordinated, more orchestrated strategy to combat financial crime in general. But there are two others that have emerged that I think are noteworthy. The first is the global trend, again, to emphasize the need for receiving banks to shoulder some portion of the reimbursement liability. That we've covered a little bit, but this is something that is sort of consistently reemerging, not just in markets in North America, but markets globally. And the other is a growing emphasis on the term customer safety. Now, this is a little bit more specific to the US market, but it is yet another data point to me that indicates that regulators are driving a lot of financial institutions in the direction of a much more orchestrated and tightly integrated financial crime strategy than ever before. So finally, the implication sections here before perhaps we can get to some questions. I mentioned this in my blog post on Mule activity recently, that infantry wins battles and logistics wins wars. I brought this old quote out because it seemed to me to encapsulate a curiosity of why there aren't more in the way of an emphasis on targeting Mule activity more deliberately and more proactively. As we've discussed, there are few incentives that exist very formally around addressing Mule activity proactively. And unfortunately, this has led to something of a gap, I think, in many FIs' financial crime strategies. And unless and until that gap is closed by one means or another, then I'm afraid the fraudsters will have something of an upper hand, at least in terms of the superior strategy. As long as they have that logistics network, they will continue to be able to carry out fraud at a large scale, at an industrial scale. So, I mentioned the increased frequency that the term customer safety has made in terms of regulators' examinations and their discussions with fraud executives and for that matter, with the executives who manage all of the units under the financial crime umbrella. It seems to me to be another pretty strong data point that suggests that the overall trajectory again here is towards a more holistic and deliberate and formally defined financial crime strategy that ultimately seeks to provide a much more robust protection and promotion of the trust relationship. And aligning each of these business units in the enterprise of protecting, again, that trust relationship. We're going to go on here in terms of the implications that all of this has with regard to sending and receiving FIs, and how all of them will come under increasing obligation to reimburse victims. Now, it can and should be argued that the case for this is not settled, and that is true. However, the data points that are emerging globally seem to indicate that this is the general trajectory that things are moving in. And I think so long as things continue to appear to be moving in this direction, it's a worthy consideration to think about how this might impact again any given FI's strategy with regard to managing financial crime. So obviously for sending banks, this would take the form of an increased emphasis on building models and risk models that would enable the FI to infer the intent behind the customers and the sender's payment. This obviously is very difficult. It's highly dependent on a lot of very nuanced contextual information. It would also be very dependent on collaboration and dependence on consortium data sources, but not surprisingly, it would also depend fairly heavily on sort of proactive or prophylactic awareness campaigns to ensure that the customers are deputized properly in the fight against scams. Channel interventions are a challenge, obviously, because they introduce a great deal of friction. They're going to be a very difficult sell in an age where the trend is very much in the opposite direction towards reducing friction and making it easier to do business. Of course, the pace and scale of scams will likely have a very important vote in that discussion. It will depend pretty heavily on the segment of one risk modeling. This is very expensive, very difficult to do, something that is a particular challenge, especially for medium and smaller size financial institutions. And for receiving banks, I think where the rubber meets the road ultimately is in that third bullet point there with mule risk models. As I mentioned before, this is second to proactive awareness and prevention campaigns. The emphasis on monitoring for inbound payments is becoming one of the most defined and most popular, and maybe gaining the most momentum in terms of the marketplace adoption, largely because it's, again, very approachable. I think most FIs have a lot of the data that is required in order to be able to model the risk of any given beneficiary as a potential mule. And it is obvious that the capacity to have knowledge of the degree of risk that any given beneficiary has or represents in terms of a potential mule, having that in hand as the inbound payment is being filtered is an extremely important bit of information to have when you consider that they're on the hook to make a accept or not accept decision for a whole lot of payments that could have the potential from becoming instantaneously converting into a liability. It's all about automation, I think. If to the degree that these risk models can be used to support an accept or accept without posting decision at the time of receipt of the payment, I think that's going to go a long way in terms of shielding receiving FIs from a net new liability, net new burden related to reimbursing the victim. Finally, and this is the last point I wanted to make, and this is kind of to resume a view into what may yet be on the horizon. I think that proactive prevention will continue to be maybe the one segment of the market that will receive the most attention and will get the highest degree of priority. I think second to that, we'll likely see the receive side detection capabilities continue to mature, largely because they are accessible. I think probably third place is likely to be the send side detection as well as the send side intervention segment of controls. I think the headwinds here again are the difficulty, the expense, and the degree of sophistication required in order to develop and deploy these kinds of controls. Network detection is I think an interesting one, and one that perhaps doesn't get quite as much attention as it should. There's a lot of very useful information that can and should be shared by networks. I think the good news here is we're seeing a lot of networks who are very eager to do so. I know both the clearinghouse as well as early warning are both actively engaged in providing these. I've heard similar plans are in the works for FedNow. All of these are very encouraging signals, but I think they have a long way to go yet before they're at least demonstrated to be very useful. I think they have a lot of potential. I think the $64,000 question here is, and one that I think is a really important one to consider, is that at what point will it make sense to begin re-examining the recovery process? In fact, in talking with a lot of UK bankers, as it became obvious that the PSR's regime is going to be deployed sometime in 2024, I asked whether or not this has shifted any attention to the recovery process and whether or not that should be automated. And obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, it has not. That was a bit of a surprise to me, because I would imagine that as soon as it became obvious that receiving banks would have a net new liability to the tune, in the case of the UK, of 480 million pounds, that they would want to do something a little bit more about recouping those some of those losses. And given that the recovery process, whether it's in the US or anywhere in virtually any other market, is one that relies on phone calls and fax machines, it's an exceptionally manual process, and not one that is very effective either. I would imagine that there's a lot of potential there to automate and to improve. So that is all I had in terms of prepared remarks. I see we have, Caitlin, I believe we have some questions that are coming through.
We do. Let's go ahead and start this one. And Trace, you might want to turn my volume down a little bit.
I will do that. Here we go. So let's see. Have you seen FIs coalesce around certain kinds of prevention or treatment strategies when they do detect a mule or incur a loss, and how effective have they been? It's a great question. There are, yes, I would say the short answer to that question is yes. There are a variety of proactive mule detection strategies, we'll say, or maybe detection patterns. Not surprisingly, a lot of them start with the identity verification segment. So there's a lot of information that comes through from those controls, and I think that does much to sort of accelerate the FI's capacity to understand who this customer is. Unfortunately, as we discussed, because so many mules are either legitimate customers who claim to be ignorant of of what they're doing as being criminal or criminally adjacent, then it is very difficult for those kinds of controls to really distinguish those customers or those particular types of mules. So a lot of post-enrollment monitoring are necessary, and the variety of the form that a lot of those post-enrollment controls take have a lot to do with monitoring non-monetary transactions and specifically interactions. So monitoring the account holders' behavioral patterns is one, specifically looking for indications that there are devices or individuals, identities that are accessing multiple accounts. These types of social network analytics techniques have often been pretty helpful. They're also fairly difficult to automate, but there are a variety of vendors in the marketplace that are, I think, pretty well suited to provide these kinds of screening capabilities, and they're definitely worth checking out. In terms of others, as I mentioned before, I think it's ultimately about automation. So most FIs are not likely to close the relationship if they see indications of mule activity. Rather, they're more likely, and this is true regardless of the market. I've talked with bankers in the UK who approach it this way, and certainly this is a very popular way to do it in the US and in Canada. But what they will do is they will score the risk of potential mules and store that information, and only unless and until they see an inbound payment that maybe breaches certain risk thresholds, would they match that incident up or that event up with whether or not that beneficiary is likely to be a mule. If those two things come together, that helps to inform and automate their capacity to inform the decision of whether to accept without posting or to reject the payment altogether in an effort to avoid that payment becoming a liability. I think I hope that answered the question. I think there are some other controls that are beginning to emerge that again are useful. I mentioned the mule persona. I think that is an important innovation and one that's worth considering. Specifically, each mule has its own unique sort of behavioral profiles, and they're going to look very different one from the other. So to the extent that you can build models that have that contextual information, they're going to be much more accurate, much more effective. So again, I would consider that in looking for solution providers. I think we have another one. How effective do you think confirmation of payee is? I've heard mixed reviews. Actually, I've heard probably more negative reviews than positive reviews. The criticisms generally are somewhat similar to criticisms of the similar efforts to confirm whether or not a given applicant is on the ECSV file. The matches are not always very accurate, and even when they are prompting the sender by way of alerts, is often just clicked through. I think that's the number one criticism I've heard, and at least the most consistent criticism, is that the senders are coached often by the fraudsters that this might happen, and to just click through. And where they're not coached, I think they're conditioned to click through prompts such as this. So I've not heard great things about confirmation of payee. I think it was a good intention. I think it was unfortunately not terribly well. I just don't think it's terribly effective. Maybe it's one layer, and certainly it's not one to dismiss, but it's not a silver bullet. Another question, and I think we've got time for one more. Our biggest challenge is with Money Mules will not accept the fact that they are mules. Any suggestions? This is not dissimilar to a lot of scam victims, unfortunately. I think there have been some interesting approaches to this. I would consider too that when it comes to having the conversation with the customer, you got to consider that again. That even if they're claiming that they're not aware, I think there's often a pretty good chance that that they are in fact aware. They're loath to admit it. I think that certainly can be true of a certain segment of that population. I think obviously there are many scenarios where they truly are unaware, when they maybe have been fooled. Certainly a lot of evidence that this happens quite a bit more than maybe we might think it does. Where the money mule is actually duped into believing that what they're doing is for something completely separate or something legitimate. And so there's I think a fairly decent amount of resistance among those folks to not want to believe that what they're doing is anything but virtuous. So some of the stories I've heard have been giving investigators who are specially trained in talking scam victims down off the ledge. It's not always successful. I think what it does ultimately is help to improve the probability of success. I think the important thing is that every effort is made to try and salvage the relationship, but ultimately you've got fairly strong evidence that the person is a mule, and then you probably have the justification needed to at least, if not close the relationship, then certainly curtail it. Let's see, maybe we have time for one last one. Are there any vendors who are particularly strong in the proactive mule detection space? I have heard, yes. Again, I would point to, it kind of depends on where you want to focus. If the interest is in emphasizing your front door controls and your application fraud controls, obviously there are some vendors out there that are particularly well suited in detecting synthetics. I've heard positive things about Socure's models in this regard. If on the other hand, because there are many other vendors who are also very capable at synthetic detection, I know that if your emphasis is more so on the behavioral analytics side, I know that BioCatch has a solution that I think many FIs who've been using it specifically for mule detection have spoken highly about it also. But that again is not to say that they're the only vendor there. There are a few vendors who play in that space as well, and there are more every day, which is all good news. Obviously, having a really robust decision engine support platform too, that plays an important role if you're really looking to automate this as much as possible and marry it up with inbound payment monitoring controls. So I believe that's all we have time for. Great questions. I thank you all for attending, and apologies again for our technical difficulties in the beginning. But thanks very much, and great pleasure. I hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, Trace. And with that, we are at a wrap. If we didn't get a chance to answer your question, we will certainly reach out and answer those for you individually. And just as a reminder, today's session was recorded, and we will be sending out a link to view that recording after the session.